And it's a fact, each Lucky's packed with fine tobacco, end-to-end taste, fine tobacco at its best. Smoke a Lucky Strike, smoke a Lucky Strike.
They were once the pride of every driveway, bold, chrome-laced beasts packed with features that would be banned today for being too wild. What happened to the world that made these everyday car features suddenly too dangerous to exist? Lighting a cigarette while driving was once as natural as turning the radio dial. In the 1970s, cars came standard with ashtrays in every seat and dashboard lighters built right into the panel. Parents would puff away with the windows rolled up, and kids in the back seat thought nothing of it. There was no stigma, no warning labels, and certainly no laws against it. In fact, smoking in a car was so routine that it was almost part of the driving culture. But over time, the science caught up. Secondhand smoke was proven dangerous, especially in confined spaces. By the early 2000s, a public health reckoning began, and by the 2010s, several states had introduced laws banning smoking in cars when children were present. Today, it is unthinkable to light up with a child in the back seat, and the idea of built-in ashtrays seems absurd. But for anyone who grew up in the 1970s, that smoky smell in the upholstery is more than a memory. It is a time capsule of a very different era, one where convenience came first and health came last. Skinny A-pillars were a stylist's dream and a safety engineer's nightmare. Back in the 1970s, sleek lines ruled the road, and the A-pillar, the part of the car that frames the windshield, was designed to be as thin as possible. The goal? Maximize visibility and keep the design looking aerodynamic and stylish. But that minimal structure came at a cost. In the event of a rollover or even a side impact, skinny A-pillars offered little to no protection. The roof could collapse like a soda can. Engineers knew it was a problem, but the auto industry was still more interested in looks than safety. That changed in the decades to come when federal standards forced automakers to reinforce the A-pillar with thicker metal and stronger support systems. Today, the thicker A-pillars are even paired with airbags and rollover sensors, making them an essential part of a car's safety system. It is one of those changes you barely notice until it saves your life. In the 1970s, headrests were not just rare, they were optional. Some car models did not even offer them, and others charged extra to add them in. It was not just a luxury issue. Back then, the dangers of whiplash were not fully understood, and people rarely questioned what their car seat lacked. You could cruise down the freeway with nothing supporting the back of your neck. In the event of a rear-end collision, your head would snap backward with nothing to stop it. The injuries were severe, sometimes lifelong, but no one thought twice. It was just how seats were built. The turning point came when crash tests and safety data began piling up. The absence of a head restraint made whiplash far more common. Slowly, regulations caught up. By the late 1980s, front seat headrests became mandatory in most countries, and modern cars eventually incorporated adjustable designs that also worked with side airbags. Asbestos brake pads were the silent danger hiding in plain sight. In the 1970s, they were everywhere, praised for their resistance to heat and their long lifespan. Mechanics liked them. Drivers trusted them. No one asked too many questions. What people did not know was that every time brakes were serviced, tiny asbestos fibers would be released into the air, inhaled by mechanics and floating invisibly through garages. Prolonged exposure led to serious illnesses, including mesothelioma and lung cancer. But for years, the connection was ignored. It was not until a flood of health studies and worker lawsuits emerged that the auto industry began to back away. Eventually, the Environmental Protection Agency stepped in, and asbestos was banned from most automotive applications. Today, you would never find it in a new car. But go digging through a classic vehicle's brake system, and you might just unearth a health hazard that outlived its welcome. What once was trusted is now outlawed, and for good reason. Leaded gasoline is one of the darkest and most quietly devastating chapters in car culture. In the 1970s, it was completely normal. Just another pump at the gas station, a few cents cheaper, and sold without warning labels. Drivers saw it as the high-performance option, It gave engines a smoother ride, eliminated knocking, and was even praised in advertisements. What nobody really talked about was what came out of the tailpipe. The additive tetraethyl lead released fine particles of toxic metal into the air with every rev of the engine. These invisible clouds of lead settled into the environment, into people's lungs, and especially into the bodies of young children. Scientists had been sounding the alarm as early as the 1920s, but the oil and automotive industries pushed back hard. They denied the risks, manipulated studies, and buried the truth. As a result, entire generations grew up breathing in poison. Brain development was stunted. Cities became lead-saturated landscapes. It took until the late 1980s and early 1990s for the United States to fully ban leaded gasoline. Dash-mounted metal knobs and switches were once a symbol of rugged reliability. In the 1970s, they were everywhere. Radio dials, climate sliders, headlight toggles, all made from solid, polished metal. Drivers liked the feel. There was something satisfying about the click of a chrome switch or the weight of a cast metal knob. It looked industrial, purposeful. But in the event of a crash, that solid utility turned into a deadly hazard. Without airbags or padded dashboards, any part of the vehicle's interior could become a weapon. Metal knobs and protruding switches would strike heads, tear skin, and cause blunt force injuries. In worst-case scenarios, they became projectiles. Back then, this was not considered a flaw. It was just part of the design. Safety was still in its infancy, and crash testing was a relatively new science. But as more accident data was collected, safety advocates and researchers raised concerns. Slowly, automakers began to redesign interior controls. Knobs were recessed. Plastic replaced metal. Edges were softened. Padded dashboards became standard, and the harsh metallic design language of the 1970s faded into history. In the 1970s, having your toddler stand between the front seats while you drove was not a crime. It was practically a rite of passage. Seatbelts were ignored. Car seats were non-existent. Children bounced around the back seat during turns and leaned on doors that had no child lock. It was chaos by today's standards, but back then, it was just another day on the road. The first wave of concern came from pediatricians, who noticed that car accidents were the leading cause of child fatalities. But the auto industry did not move fast. It took public outrage, followed by government regulation, to begin turning the tide. Today, child safety seats are mandated, crash-tested, and legally enforced across nearly every state. The idea of letting a child ride without one is not just illegal, it is unthinkable. But if you ever talk to someone who grew up in the 1970s, they will probably have a memory of sitting on their father's lap and steering for fun. Steel dashboards were the definition of built to last. They were cold, they were heavy, and they were absolutely lethal in a crash. In the 1970s, most American cars came with a solid steel dash, often painted to match the color of the interior or accented with polished trim. It gave the vehicle a sense of rugged durability, like it was carved out of an industrial machine. And people loved it. That weight and shine made the driver feel like they were in control of something powerful. But power is not protection. That same dashboard that looked impressive could become a deadly force in even a minor accident. Without airbags, and with seatbelts not yet mandatory or widely used, any sudden stop could send your body straight into a sheet of cold metal. Foreheads cracked open, chests crushed, teeth knocked out. For years, this was simply accepted. Safety testing was still a new field, and design ruled over function. But by the end of the decade, the numbers were impossible to ignore. Crash test dummies slammed into those steel dashes with horrifying results. The industry started to shift. Padded dashboards were rolled out first, then collapsible steering columns, then airbags. Slowly, comfort replaced cold steel, and lives were saved. Smog was not just a nuisance in the 1970s. It was a constant reminder of what was choking America's skies. Los Angeles became the symbol of environmental decay, with its yellow-orange haze hanging low over the skyline, stinging eyes, irritating lungs, and shortening lifespans. Children grew up never knowing what a clear blue sky looked like. People walked the streets with scarves over their mouths, or worse, not at all. The cause? Cars. Or more specifically, cars without any emissions control systems. No catalytic converters, no smog pumps, no charcoal canisters, just raw, chemical-laced exhaust billowing out of tailpipes in every direction. Engines ran rich with fuel. Lead and carbon poured into the atmosphere. It was a time when horsepower was everything and pollution was somebody else's problem. But then, science started yelling. Doctors linked smog to asthma, cancer, and birth defects. Environmentalists screamed louder. Eventually, even lawmakers listened. The Clean Air Act of the 1970s forced automakers to rethink combustion. Catalytic converters became mandatory. Fuel systems were refined. Engines burned cleaner. Air quality slowly improved. But those early years of neglect still cast a long shadow. Even now, when we see haze creeping over a distant skyline, some remember what it was like when the entire sky looked that way every day. Pop-up headlights were the coolest trick your car could pull. You flicked a switch, and boom, they rose up from the hood like secret gadgets from a spy movie. They looked sleek. They made your car feel alive. In the 1970s, they were the very symbol of cutting-edge design. Sports cars, muscle cars, even a few family vehicles had them. Designers loved the symmetry. Advertisers loved the drama. And drivers, they loved the way people stared when those lights popped into place at dusk. But nobody asked how safe they were. That sharp edge around the pop-up panel became a real problem when pedestrian safety came into focus. In a collision, those rigid lights acted like blades. People were getting seriously injured from what should have been minor accidents. Europe acted first, outlawing the design as pedestrian safety regulations took hold. The United States followed not long after. Slowly but surely, automakers phased them out, and by the early 2000s, they were gone from new production entirely. Enthusiasts still miss them. Car shows still celebrate them. But in real-world safety terms, their time had passed. What was once futuristic and iconic had become a liability. Today, pop-up headlights are remembered as relics of a more daring era, one where style often trumped safety, and no one thought a little sharp metal could hurt so much. But it did. It hurt just enough to make the whole industry turn the lights off on them, for good. Side exit exhausts were a muscle car's battle cry. In the 1970s, it was not uncommon to see performance cars with pipes that exited just behind the front wheels or along the side skirts. The sound was thunderous, the look aggressive, and the feel was pure adrenaline. These side-mounted exhausts were more than just cosmetic, they were functional, designed to reduce back pressure and give drivers that satisfying roar with every press of the pedal. But there was a trade-off. Side exit systems vented emissions closer to pedestrians and passengers. The noise levels were off the charts, sometimes enough to trip sound ordinances in residential neighborhoods. Over time, states began to restrict them, citing both environmental and public health concerns. Emissions had to exit farther from the cabin. Noise limits were imposed. Side pipes became the stuff of car shows and private collections rather than city streets. Today, they are a rare sight, often illegal unless specially modified or kept off public roads. What was once a symbol of raw power is now a ghost of a louder, less regulated time. Single-side mirrors were once the norm. In the 1970s, many vehicles only came equipped with a driver's side mirror, while the passenger side was either optional or missing entirely. It saved money and, supposedly, cleaned up the look of the car. But it came at the cost of visibility. Changing lanes meant turning your whole body, guessing what was in the blind spot, and hoping for the best. Accidents were common. Rear-view mirrors could only show so much, and without that extra mirror on the right, drivers were at a disadvantage, especially on highways. Over time, the federal government and safety advocates pushed back. Research showed that having mirrors on both sides significantly reduced the risk of collisions. By the late 1980s, regulations had shifted, and passenger side mirrors became mandatory in most new vehicles. Today, you would never imagine buying a car with only one mirror. It feels absurd. But in the 1970s, that was just how things were. a small corner of visibility traded for a cleaner silhouette and a big dose of risk. Unregulated window tinting was like putting sunglasses on your entire car. In the 1970s, people darkened their windows for style, privacy, and to beat the summer heat, often without a second thought. The darker the tint, the cooler the vibe. Some even added mirrored or metallic finishes to reflect sunlight and give their ride a futuristic edge. It looked great, but it also created a serious safety concern. Drivers with dark tints had reduced visibility at night and during storms. Police officers could not see inside the car during traffic stops, raising issues of security and enforcement. Pedestrians were harder to spot through obscured glass. Eventually, lawmakers responded. States began introducing strict regulations on how dark a window could be, measured in visible light transmission percentages. Some states banned mirrored finishes altogether. Today, window tinting is still popular, but it must follow detailed guidelines. Factory glass comes lightly tinted, and aftermarket jobs must be within legal limits. If it is too dark, it will get flagged. The old days of blackout tint and chrome-mirrored glass are over. What was once cool is now considered a liability. Push-button transmissions were the future once, or so they seemed. In the 1970s, some Chryslers came with a dash-mounted button panel instead of a traditional gear lever. You would tap a button for drive, reverse, or neutral, and off you went. It felt space-age, it was convenient, and it was dangerous. The early versions lacked critical safety features like a park lockout. That meant you could accidentally hit the wrong button or even shift into reverse while moving forward. The margin for error was slim, and accidents happened. People backed into walls, lurched into traffic, or shifted into neutral at highway speeds. The system was pulled from the market within a few years, but the damage had been done. Engineers went back to the drawing board, and the standard shift lever returned as king. Today's push-button transmissions, like those in modern luxury cars, are safer, regulated, and locked behind fail-safes. But the early versions from the 1970s serve as a reminder. Innovation without caution can create more risk than reward. Non-collapsible steering columns were a hidden danger most drivers never thought about. In the 1970s, steering shafts were often constructed as single solid metal rods. This design was simple, inexpensive, and durable, but brutally unsafe. In a frontal collision, that solid shaft would not crumple. It would act like a javelin, shooting straight toward the driver's chest or face with tremendous force. Many people were severely injured or even killed because of these rigid components. The impact forces that should have been absorbed by the vehicle were instead transferred directly to the driver's body. Even at relatively low speeds, the consequences were devastating. Internal injuries, broken ribs, and crushed sternums were not uncommon. Engineers and safety advocates started ringing alarm bells, but change came slowly. The auto industry was hesitant to redesign something so central to the car's mechanical system. Eventually, public pressure and mounting injury data pushed regulators to act. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, collapsible steering columns became standard in new vehicles. These columns were designed to collapse like an accordion on impact, absorbing energy and sparing the driver from the worst forces of a crash. Today, collapsible columns are just one of many hidden safety features we depend on without ever seeing them work. But back then, every drive came with an invisible risk, one that would only reveal itself when it was far too late. Crumple zones might sound weak, but they are one of the most effective and overlooked safety breakthroughs in the history of automotive engineering. Back in the 1970s, cars were tanks, thick steel panels, rigid frames, and bodies built to feel indestructible. That strength made people feel safe, but it was a deadly illusion. The problem was that energy from a crash had nowhere to go. Instead of being dispersed, the force transferred directly into the occupants. Broken bones, crushed organs, and fatal internal injuries were common in high-speed crashes. The stronger the car, the harder the impact on the human body. Then came a radical new idea. What if the car absorbed the force instead? Engineers introduced crumple zones, sections at the front and rear of the car designed to deform and collapse during a collision. These zones sacrifice the car's body to preserve the cabin and, more importantly, the people inside it. Tests showed dramatic drops in injury and fatality rates. Though initially met with skepticism by automakers and enthusiasts who feared weak cars, crumple zones soon became required by law. Modern cars now feature finely tuned impact zones, collapsible components, and frame reinforcements, all working together in split seconds to save lives. The body might bend and break, but that is exactly what it is supposed to do. In this case, weakness is strength. Glass fuel bowls were once a hallmark of engine simplicity. Found in many 1970s carburetors, these small, clear bowls let drivers and mechanics visually inspect fuel flow and look for contamination. It seemed practical. No guesswork, no need to disassemble parts, just take a peek. For hobbyists and gearheads, it was even considered elegant. But beneath that simplicity was a serious flaw. Glass shatters. In the event of an accident or even a heavy jolt under the hood, the bowl could break. Gasoline would spill into hot engine parts, turning a minor crash into a blazing fire. There were even cases where vibrations during regular driving cracked the bowls, causing slow leaks that drivers did not notice until it was too late. As fuel injection systems began replacing carburetors, these bowls slowly vanished. Plastic and metal fuel delivery systems offered the same functionality, without the risk of fragmentation. Sealed fuel rails and injectors became standard, and the era of see-through fuel bowls quietly ended. Today, you will only find them on antique models or in classic car restoration garages. They are relics now, nostalgic for their look but recognized for their danger. In hindsight, letting flammable liquid rest inside a breakable shell in the engine bay seems less like smart engineering and more like a ticking time bomb. Back in the 1970s, 2 brake lights were considered more than enough. Positioned on the left and right rear corners of the vehicle, they illuminated when the driver hit the brakes, signaling a stop or slowdown. It worked, until it didn't. If one bulb burned out, or if a tall vehicle blocked the view, drivers behind could be left guessing. Rear-end collisions were far more common than they are today, and research eventually uncovered the reason. Drivers often did not have a clear line of sight to the existing brake lights, especially in heavy traffic or during nighttime driving. The solution was simple but revolutionary. Add a third brake light in the center. Positioned higher and in the direct line of sight, the third brake light improved reaction times by up to half a second according to early studies. That might not sound like much, but at highway speeds it could mean the difference between a sudden stop and a dangerous crash. The feature became federally mandated in 1986 and was quickly adopted worldwide. Today, it is hard to imagine a car without that middle red light blinking at you in traffic. We do not often think about it, but it is one of the most quietly effective safety features in every modern vehicle, born from the shortcomings of a 2-light system that simply could not keep up. Chrome interiors were pure eye candy in the 1970s. Shiny dashboards, polished knobs, reflective trim. Everything was designed to gleam in the sunlight and catch your eye. It was a style statement. Drivers wanted their interiors to feel upscale, futuristic, and flashy, and Chrome delivered on all fronts. But this glossy material came with an unintended consequence: glare. Bright sun would bounce off the chrome and reflect directly into the driver's eyes. In the right light, it could obscure the road, blind a driver temporarily, or make it nearly impossible to see dashboard gauges. Drivers squinted. Accidents happened. Over time, designers began to understand the cost of all that dazzle. Function had to come before flash. Matte finishes, darker tones, and textured materials began to replace the chrome-heavy dashboards. Soft-touch plastics and vinyl became the new standard, not because they were cheaper, but because they made the cabin safer. Today, chrome is still used, but in moderation and only in areas that will not reflect into a driver's line of sight. It is a subtle change that most drivers do not notice, but it makes a world of difference. The old chrome interiors may look stunning at a car show, but on the open road, they were more blinding than beautiful. Safety outshined sparkle in the end. center-mounted lap belts were once considered cutting-edge safety equipment. In the 1970s, if your car had seat belts at all, chances are it only had lap belts, especially in the rear center seat. These belts wrapped low across the hips and clicked into place with a satisfying snap. No one questioned their effectiveness. It was better than nothing, people said. But over time, researchers and crash data revealed a darker truth. In a high-impact collision, those lap belts caused serious injuries. The human body would bend forward violently, with no upper restraint to stop the motion. Internal organs bore the brunt of the force. Spine damage, abdominal trauma, and even fatal injuries were linked directly to lap-only restraints. For children and smaller passengers, the risk was even higher. As shoulder harnesses became standard in front seats, attention turned to the back seats. Laws changed. By the 1990s, most cars were required to include three-point belts, lap and shoulder combined, for every seating position, including the rear center. Today, a lap belt on its own is not just outdated, it is illegal in many countries. Safety no longer settles for better than nothing. It demands protection that actually works. And that old center seat belt, once a quiet feature tucked into the upholstery, became a cautionary tale written in broken bones. Fixed, non-retractable antennas were once as iconic as white wall tires or hood ornaments. In the 1970s, nearly every car came with a long, rigid metal antenna bolted to the fender or windshield pillar. It stood tall, catching radio waves and catching everything else too: tree branches, car wash rollers, and the hands of mischievous kids. These antennas were functional, but they were fragile. A wrong move snapped them clean off. In some cases, they became tools for vandalism or even theft, easily removed and repurposed. They also added wind noise, disrupted aerodynamics, and sometimes just looked awkward. As technology improved, so did the designs. Power antennas that retracted when not in use became the new luxury. Later, short, stubby antennas and in-glass signal receivers took over. Today, most modern vehicles do not even have visible antennas. The system is built right into the rear windshield or roofline, invisible and protected. What once stood tall as a proud little rod now lives hidden and efficient. You rarely think about where your signal comes from anymore, and that is the point. It is cleaner, it is safer, and it is one less thing to snap off in a parking garage. Those old antennas might stir nostalgia, but few miss the days of wrestling with a bent piece of metal just to hear the evening news. Factory ashtrays and cigarette lighters in every seat once felt like luxury. In the 1970s, nearly every car, regardless of make or model, came with at least one lighter and ashtray, and often more than one. The dashboard had a pop-out tray. The back seat had its own compartments. Sometimes the doors did too. Smoking while driving was so common that these features were treated like cup holders are today. You lit up at red lights. You flicked ashes out the window. It was the culture, and car manufacturers made sure you could do it in style. But time and science changed everything. As the dangers of secondhand smoke became undeniable and smoking rates began to fall, so did the need for ashtrays. By the 1990s, automakers started removing them from standard packages. In some countries, regulations outright banned lighters and ashtrays from new vehicle designs. Today, if you find one in a new car, it is likely part of an optional smoker's package, something you have to request separately. Most new cars offer power ports instead, repurposing what used to be a cigarette lighter into a place to charge your phone. It is a quiet cultural shift, a symbol of how the world changed. Once seen as essential, ashtrays are now relics of a past we left behind, in the name of cleaner air and safer habits. No airbags. That is the reality of most cars from the 1970s, even the luxurious ones. Airbags were still a novelty, a prototype idea floating around in design labs. A few experimental models featured rudimentary versions, but the technology was inconsistent, expensive, and often seen as unnecessary. Most drivers relied solely on seatbelts, if they used them at all. In the event of a crash, your body went wherever the force took it, face first into the steering wheel. into the windshield, across the cabin. The results were brutal. Serious head trauma and chest injuries were common, and fatalities in frontal collisions were high. It took decades of research, tragic crash data, and relentless advocacy before airbags became standard. In 1989, the first mass-market vehicle with a driver's side airbag rolled out. By the 1990s, dual airbags became mandatory in all new cars sold in the United States. Today, cars can have as many as 10 airbags surrounding passengers in a cocoon of protection. But back then, there was nothing, just a thin steering wheel and some faith. The fact that we once put millions of people on the road without a single airbag sounds unthinkable now. But that was the norm, and it took a generation of painful lessons to finally change it. Wraparound panoramic windshields were a dramatic swing at futuristic design that looked amazing, but came with some surprising challenges. Popular in the 1950s and early 1960s, these curved glass windshields wrapped around the sides of the car, creating an almost bubble-like cockpit. They gave cars a wide, open view of the road and enhanced that jet-age space race aesthetic that defined the era. To look at them was to imagine flight. But to drive with them? That was a different story. The extreme curves created glare. The thick corner pillars made it harder to see while turning, and the custom glass was expensive to replace. Still, these windshields were works of art. They defined the look of Chevrolets, Buicks, and Oldsmobiles for an entire generation. Eventually, safety regulations and practical concerns led to more conventional designs. But the wraparound windshield remains an icon of mid-century design, a time when cars were bold, futuristic, and not afraid to push the limits, even if visibility suffered a little in the name of style. Believe it or not, for years the passenger side mirror was not standard equipment. That is right. Many cars rolled off the lot with just one side mirror, usually mounted on the driver's door. No second mirror, no symmetry, and definitely no blind spot awareness. The logic at the time was that a driver could simply turn their head to check the right side. But on highways, in traffic, or while merging, that was far from safe. Changing lanes became an educated guess. Some drivers added aftermarket mirrors, others stuck with the single view and hoped for the best. This was especially dangerous in wide cars or low-slung models where visibility was already limited. Rear-view mirrors helped, but they only told part of the story. It was not until the 1980s that passenger-side mirrors became common, and even then, they were sometimes an extra cost option. Safety advocates pushed for their inclusion, citing accidents caused by blind spots and limited rear visibility. Eventually, regulations caught up, and now dual side mirrors are required by law in most countries. Today, many cars come with blind spot monitoring, lane change alerts, and wide-angle glass. But for decades, half the rear view was missing, and nobody thought twice about it. Hand choke knobs were the kind of thing that made you feel like a mechanic every time you started your car. Before electronic fuel injection, cold mornings meant fiddling with a little knob on the dash. Pull it out to enrich the fuel mix. Push it in once the engine warmed up. It was simple, but it required feel. Too much choke and you flooded the engine. Too little and the car would stall. Drivers learned to listen, to sense when it was just right. It made every ignition feel personal, like a handshake between you and the machine. For many, it was a morning ritual, one more step in the dance of daily life. You had to know your car. You had to understand its mood. Starting it was not just about turning a key. It was a relationship. But technology moved on. Carburetors gave way to fuel injection, which gave way to computer-controlled systems that adjusted everything for you. Suddenly, the driver was no longer in charge of the mix. Engines became smarter, more efficient, and far less hands-on. The choke knob disappeared, and while most drivers welcomed the ease of modern ignitions, some missed the tactile connection. That little knob, now extinct, was a symbol of a time when starting your car meant you were part of the machine, not just a passenger along for the ride. Hidden headlight washer. Nozzles were one of those blink-and-you-miss-it features on select luxury cars from the 1970s and 1980s. These tiny, retractable nozzles were built right into the bumper or tucked beneath the headlight casing itself. With a push of a button, they sprayed jets of water or washer fluid onto the headlights, clearing off mud, snow, and grime in seconds. It was especially useful for long drives in bad weather when visibility mattered most. Drivers of models like the Mercedes-Benz S-Class or certain Cadillacs would activate it before pulling into a driveway, ensuring their headlights looked spotless and sharp. But the feature was delicate. The nozzles often clogged or jammed. They were expensive to repair and sometimes over-engineered for what they offered. As headlights improved with better materials and sleeker designs, the need faded. Today, headlight washers are mostly found on high-end vehicles, and even then, usually built into more integrated systems. But for those who remember the tiny pop-up sprayers appearing with a soft hiss and clearing the lights like tiny windshield wipers, it was one more detail that made the car feel alive, taking care of itself with elegance and subtlety. Early cars were built tough, sometimes too tough. Without crumple zones, the body of the car was rigid and unforgiving, like a steel cage with no give. In a crash, all that force had to go somewhere, and more often than not, it went straight to the people inside. The logic at the time was that stronger cars were safer cars, but engineers eventually realized that a solid frame does not absorb energy, it transfers it. So in a head-on collision, instead of the car taking the hit, your body did. Bones broke, organs ruptured, and the impact felt like being thrown against a brick wall at full speed. For decades, automakers resisted changing the design. After all, who wanted a car that bent like a soda can? But safety experts argued that a car should collapse in a controlled way, using its structure to absorb the shock and protect its occupants. The turning point came in the 1960s, when crash tests showed just how deadly rigid frames could be. Slowly, crumple zones became part of the design. Front and rear sections engineered to fold, bend, and deform in specific ways during a crash. Fender-mounted turn signal indicators were once a small but genius addition to your dashboard visibility. Tiny illuminated arrows, often mounted right on the front fenders, let the driver know when a blinker was on, even when road noise or sunlight made it hard to hear or see from inside. It was like your car giving you a visual nod, confirming, yes, your signal is still blinking. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, this was more than a design flourish. It was functional peace of mind. Especially helpful during long highway drives or in noisy environments, these indicators glowed softly, telling you if you had forgotten to cancel your turn signal. But as dashboard displays evolved and turn signal mechanisms became more sophisticated, fender indicators lost their place. People started relying on internal cues, clicking sounds, blinking dash lights. The little arrows outside became redundant. Plus, they added to manufacturing complexity and cost. Eventually, car makers dropped them in favor of cleaner fender lines and less clutter on the body. Yet for drivers who grew up with them, fender signals were a small touch that made a big difference. A quiet, constant reminder that sometimes the simplest features are the ones you miss the most. Car radios with reverb options were part musical experiment, part marketing flair, and totally unforgettable for those who heard them. In the 1960s, some higher-end American cars, especially from brands like Ford and Chrysler, offered radios with built-in reverb effects. The idea was to recreate the acoustics of a concert hall inside your car. Turn the knob, and suddenly the music gained depth, echo, and a kind of floating delay that made it sound bigger than life. It was particularly popular for listening to crooners or surf rock. The guitar twanged, the vocals shimmered, and everything felt just a little more cinematic. But the system had quirks. The reverb box, often mounted in the trunk or under the dash, relied on springs to create the effect. Hit a pothole or slam the brakes, and the springs would rattle, creating a strange boing or crash in your favorite song. Still, for those chasing premium sound before cassettes and CDs, it was a luxurious upgrade. Eventually, as stereo systems and digital audio took over, the reverb feature faded away. But for a brief moment in car audio history, drivers were not just playing music, They were performing it inside a mobile echo chamber. Back in the day, some cars didn't ask you to turn a key or push a button. Instead, they handed over the power to a little knob on the dashboard. These pull-knob ignition switches were often located right within reach of curious fingers, or worse, in the perfect spot to be jostled during a sudden stop or collision. With a simple tug, the engine roared to life, and just as easily, it could be cut off. The idea was convenience, but the reality was chaos. Parents quickly realized that kids could start the car without meaning to. Mechanics dreaded explaining why the vehicle wouldn't start, only to find the knob halfway pulled out. And in an accident, it was all too easy for that same knob to be yanked mid-impact, either shutting the engine down or sparking other issues. It was one of those designs that seemed clever in theory but proved risky in practice. Later innovations in ignition were all about safety and control, features sorely lacking in this setup. Still, the pull knob holds a strange kind of nostalgic charm. It reminds us of an era when cars were simpler, but also far less forgiving. Car phones bolted to the center console were once the pinnacle of cool. In the 1980s and early 1990s, having a phone in your car was not about convenience, it was about status. Businessmen, real estate agents, and flashy socialites all wanted one. They were heavy, bulky, and often connected by thick, coiled cords. The phone itself looked like a miniature brick with an antenna sticking out the top, mounted in the middle of the car like it was a throne. These phones rarely worked well. Calls dropped constantly, and signal strength was unreliable unless you were in a major city. The cost was outrageous too, with installation fees, monthly charges, and per-minute rates that made even a short call feel like a luxury. But that was the point. It was never really about the conversation. It was about being seen. Pulling up in traffic with one hand on the wheel and the other holding a car phone? That was the move. It screamed success. But like most tech trends, it faded fast. As mobile phones became smaller, cheaper, and more powerful, these bolted-down relics looked downright primitive. By the late 1990s, the car phone was history, replaced by the very devices that once copied its swagger. Until the late 1960s, most front seats in American cars were just that. Seats. No headrests, no upper support, just a padded back that stopped near your shoulders, leaving your neck exposed and unsupported in the event of a crash. In rear-end collisions, that meant instant whiplash. The sudden jolt of the impact snapped the neck backward and forward with brutal force, leading to everything from strained muscles to serious spinal injury. And it happened all the time. Whiplash was so common it became a punchline. Chiropractors knew the injury well. Insurance companies did too. But for years, nobody demanded headrests. Some luxury cars had them as options, and aftermarket headrest kits were sold for a while. But they were rare. The public simply accepted the risk, assuming that whiplash was just the cost of doing business in a crash. In 1969, federal regulations finally made front seat headrests mandatory in the United States. The change was quiet, but significant. Studies showed a dramatic reduction in soft tissue neck injuries in rear-end collisions. Suddenly, every new car had a little cushion above the seatback, and no one complained. Swiveling sun visors with vanity mirrors were small touches that felt luxurious long before touchscreen dashboards took over. These visors were not just for blocking the sun straight ahead. They could rotate to the side, follow the light, and even flip down over your side window. In premium models, they included lighted vanity mirrors with sliding covers, often on both the driver and passenger side. For drivers, it meant comfort and control. For passengers, it meant a quick glance and a touch-up without fumbling for a mirror. In convertibles and coupes, the feature added style and function all at once. The lights were soft, the covers clicked into place with satisfying precision, and everything felt just a little more thoughtful. Over time, cost-cutting and simpler interior designs reduced these visors to basic panels with minimal features. But back then, it felt like your car anticipated your needs, whether you were trying to see the road or check your lipstick. A small, elegant nod to the idea that every detail mattered. It might be hard to believe, but rear passengers in many cars had no seatbelts at all. even well into the 1980s. The assumption was simple and dangerously wrong. The back seat was safe enough. Automakers focused on protecting front passengers, where most crashes were believed to occur. But in rear-end collisions or side impacts, backseat occupants could be thrown forward with massive force. Without restraints, they slammed into seatbacks, windows, or worse, became projectiles, endangering everyone else in the car. Children and adults alike were vulnerable. Even when lap belts were eventually added to rear seats, they were often buried under the cushions or ignored entirely by passengers who had grown up without them. Shoulder belts came later and for many years were only available in the center rear seat on high-end models. It was not until the 1990s that rear seat belt laws began to appear across the United States, and even then, enforcement lagged behind. Crash test data and injury reports finally forced the industry to respond. Today, rear seat belt use is common and legally required in most places. But the journey there was slow and marked by a false sense of security. Curb feelers were the kind of feature that looked silly but saved your car. Thin metal wires or spring-loaded arms attached near the wheel wells, they hung low and stuck out just enough to scrape the curb before your tires did. That scraping sound was your signal. You were too close. In the 1950s and 1960s, when white-wall tires and gleaming hubcaps were everything, curb feelers kept those expensive rims pristine. They made parallel parking easier. They gave new drivers a bit of confidence. Sure, they looked like whiskers, and yes, they sometimes made an embarrassing screech when you parked. But they worked. Unfortunately, they also broke easily. They rattled. They rusted. And as design evolved, they started to clash with the cleaner lines of modern cars. Electronic parking sensors and backup cameras arrived and made feelers obsolete. But some old-school drivers still swear by them, especially on classic cars. Because while your modern car might beep at you, curb feelers spoke with a scratch. And for those who remember them, that sound was a weird kind of comfort. The steering wheels of the past were not just tools. They were hazards. Made from hard plastic or thin metal, these wheels offered no padding, no cushioning, and zero give in a crash. They looked sleek, often chrome-ringed or color-matched to the interior, but they were built more like dinner plates than safety equipment. In a frontal collision, your body would surge forward, right into the wheel. The result? Broken noses, cracked teeth, facial injuries, and sometimes worse. The wheel did not bend. It did not absorb. It simply waited for impact, and impact came fast. Safety experts warned about it for years, but change was slow. Automakers focused more on design than survivability. A wheel that collapsed or deformed was seen as a failure, not a feature. It took time, lawsuits, and a growing pile of medical data to prove otherwise. By the 1970s, padded steering wheels began appearing, sometimes with foam centers, soft vinyl coverings, or breakaway components. Later, airbags added another layer of protection. Glow-in-the-dark dashboard dials were a subtle but enchanting feature in post-war American cars. Before dashboard lighting became standard, automakers used luminous paint, often made with safe phosphorescent compounds, to coat speedometers, gauges, and switches. After exposure to daylight, the dials would softly glow greenish-blue at night, giving off an otherworldly light that guided the driver without distracting them. The glow was faint, quiet, and personal. It felt like the car was gently whispering information rather than shouting it. In an age without backlit LED displays or high-intensity bulbs, this soft glow was enough. You could see your speed, your fuel level, and your temperature gauge, just enough to stay safe without ruining your night vision. As materials advanced and electroluminescence became affordable, these paints were phased out. Still, there was something poetic about that after-dark glow. It was like fireflies in the dashboard, a tiny bit of magic every time the sun went down. Vent windows, sometimes called wing windows, were little triangular lifesavers. Located at the front corners of the car doors, they swung open to let fresh air rush in. Before air conditioning was standard, they were everything. Need a breeze without the roar of a rolled-down window? just crack the vent. It let in air, pushed out cigarette smoke, and added a touch of freedom to every ride. They felt clever, compact, almost magical. But they also leaked. Rain got in, wind noise got loud, and thieves loved them, an easy break-in point. By the 1980s, vent windows were fading fast. Designers favored sleek, unbroken glass. Climate control took over. And just like that, the charming little triangle became a casualty of progress. But those who drove with a wing window cracked open on a warm night? They remember how sweet, simple airflow used to be. Before collapsible steering columns became the norm, that long metal shaft in front of you was more than a way to steer. It was a direct line to disaster. In older vehicles, especially those built before the mid-1960s, the steering column was a solid piece of metal mounted directly to the frame. That meant in a head-on collision, when the front of the car crumpled inward, the steering column was pushed straight back, right into the driver's chest or face. It did not happen every time, but when it did, the results were catastrophic. The column could break ribs, puncture lungs, or worse. Drivers were essentially impaled by the very mechanism they used to control the car. For years, the design was never questioned. It was just the way cars were made. But as crash data accumulated and injury reports became impossible to ignore, engineers began searching for alternatives. By the late 1960s, regulations required collapsible steering columns, designed with joints, sleeves, and energy-absorbing materials that would collapse in a crash rather than stab the driver. It was a simple fix with life-saving results. Today, collapsible columns are standard, and nobody thinks twice about them. But in the early days, driving meant trusting that a steel spear aimed at your chest would not become your worst enemy. Fender-mounted mirrors with interior adjustment stalks were a clever fix to a practical problem, and a striking design statement. In the 1940s and 1950s, side mirrors were not mounted on the doors. They were placed far out on the front fenders, close to the headlights. It looked stylish and kept the driver's field of vision wide open. But reaching them to adjust, nearly impossible while driving. So some models offered an interior rod or cable system, usually a slim stalk mounted near the dashboard, that allowed the driver to nudge the mirror from inside the car. It was primitive, yes, but also genius. With a small twist or push, you could reposition the mirror on the go. No rolling down the window, no stretching across the hood. Over time, these systems became more refined, but eventually lost favor. Door-mounted mirrors took over, offering better lines of sight and easier access. And by the 1980s, powered mirrors made manual adjustment seem outdated altogether. But there was something tactile and satisfying about those little control rods. They made you feel like the car was built for real driving, not just for show. And the image of those mirrors, perched proudly on the fender like chrome antennae, remains one of the most iconic silhouettes of American motoring. Old door handles looked cool, chrome-plated, sculpted, and sometimes shaped like little rocket wings. They were style statements as much as functional parts. But they had a hidden danger. Many of these handles protruded from the body and had sharp edges or push-button mechanisms that stuck out like hooks. In side-impact crashes, they could catch on clothing or limbs. Worse, they sometimes failed to open when hit from the wrong angle, or jammed completely. In rollover accidents, the shape of these handles made it easy for doors to swing open or pop out of alignment, especially if the latch mechanism was not properly engaged. In a time before side airbags, side impact beams, or reinforced door structures, the handle itself could become a point of injury. As safety regulations evolved in the 1960s and 1970s, designers were forced to rethink how door handles worked. Flush-mounted handles became the new standard, designed to reduce snagging, improve aerodynamics, and most importantly, minimize the risk of accidental openings during a crash. Today's handles are often integrated so smoothly into the bodywork that they disappear completely when not in use. Automatic seat belts sounded like a brilliant idea. Close the door, and a motorized belt would glide along a track and strap across your chest. No need to buckle up, it buckled for you. It was part safety, part science fiction. Popular in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they were supposed to increase seatbelt usage in a time when people still ignored them. These systems were installed to meet government safety regulations without requiring airbags, at least not yet. But there was a catch. The shoulder belt moved automatically, but the lap belt had to be buckled manually. Most people skipped it. That meant the safety system was incomplete and sometimes dangerous. If you were in an accident and the lap belt was not secured, the chest belt alone could cause serious injuries. Malfunctions were common. Belts jammed, motors failed, and the entire mechanism became more of a hassle than a help. Drivers complained, passengers rolled their eyes, even insurance companies began questioning their effectiveness. Eventually, airbags became mandatory and offered a more complete form of protection. These robotic belts, once seen as a marvel, were quietly phased out. What was meant to save lives became an awkward footnote in automotive history, a strange in-between stage during a time of transition. Today, very few people remember them fondly, but those who do remember the feeling of being strapped in by their own car like something out of a futuristic cartoon. Cigarette lighter illumination rings were a small but elegant touch that made a big difference during night drives. In many American luxury cars from the 1950s through the 1970s, the cigarette lighter socket was framed with a softly glowing ring, usually in chrome with a translucent insert that glowed amber or green. The idea was simple: help the driver find the lighter in the dark without fumbling or distraction. At a time when smoking while driving was not just accepted but expected, this feature added a layer of style and convenience. The rings were wired into the dashboard lighting circuit and glowed whenever the headlights were on. It was a tiny piece of ambient lighting long before that term existed. Over time, as smoking declined and center consoles changed, the illuminated lighter ring disappeared. Today, that socket is used for phone chargers and gadgets, and its once glowing border is now forgotten. But for those who remember late-night drives, a cigarette glowing orange, and the soft light guiding your hand to the lighter, that ring was more than just a light. It was part of the rhythm of the road. Long before your steering wheel had buttons and stalks, the high beam switch was on the floor. That is right. Your left foot controlled the headlights. Press it once to flash. Press it again to blind every deer for miles. It was mechanical, satisfying, and a little clunky. But back then, it worked. Especially in trucks and sedans from the 1940s through the 1970s, the floor-mounted dimmer was just another part of driving. Drivers could adjust their lights without letting go of the wheel. It felt intuitive, until it did not. Dirt, rain, and salt wore down the switch fast. In winter, it might freeze. In summer, it might short out. Over time, steering column switches took over, more accessible, less exposed. Technology advanced, and safety won. But some folks still remember pressing that metal button with a steel-toed boot and lighting up the road like a runway. That switch might be gone, but its click still echoes in memories of night drives long past. The classic bench seat had style, space, and a whole lot of risk. Found in most cars before the 1980s, especially sedans and pickup trucks, the front bench seat was basically a padded couch bolted to the floor. It allowed 3 people to sit across the front: driver, passenger, and sometimes an unlucky person in the middle with nowhere to hold on. These seats were wide, flat, and often slippery, especially if they were covered in vinyl. But the real problem? No support. No side bolsters. No safety belts in the early years. In sharp turns or sudden stops, passengers could slide sideways or forward, colliding with the dashboard, the windshield, or each other. And during crashes, the bench seat offered nothing to keep you in place. Some models eventually added lap belts, but even then, without shoulder harnesses or modern restraints, the seat did little more than keep you sitting down, until the laws of physics took over. The front bench seat began fading away in the 1980s as bucket seats became more popular for comfort and safety. They provided better body support and allowed for center consoles with storage, gear shifters, and airbags. Today, you rarely see a bench seat outside of old classics and vintage trucks. They might look cool in movies and retro photos, but back in the day, they were one sharp turn away from chaos. Miss any of these banned car features or glad they're gone? Drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe for more rides through the past.